I'd spent about a year and a half of my time in the service just in training. It's how long it took to get me onto an active duty assignment, PCS assignment, which as it happened was at Beale Air Force Base, and north of Sacramento, just outside of Marysville. And I arrived there. When did I get there? Excuse me. Would have been, I guess, in the spring of 1968. Could that be? Yeah. And I went on. I was assigned to a crew, and once I had done everything I was supposed to do to get certified on that crew, then I was a regular member of a B-52 crew stationed at this base in California, serving in every couple of weeks on alert, living in an alert facility, surrounded by guards and fences, with our bombers just outside of the alert facility loaded with nuclear weapons. They would rotate as a squadron, complete, everybody. But they needed other crews as well, so they took single crews from other bases like mine at Beale Air Force Base in my G models. So I had to go back to Castle and get trained in Ds. My crew did, and then they sent us overseas. So we actually flew our plane over from Castle Air Force Base, landed in Hawaii, then took off again after the plane had been refueled, flew to a base on the island of Guam, which is an American protector in the Western Pacific. The base is called Anderson Air Base, an American base. And that's where we landed. That's where we left our plane. And that's when we started flying missions into to Vietnam. Actually, my crew and I did 2 tours like that. We would rotate among 3 bases. I mentioned Anderson on Guam. Another base from which we flew missions over Southeast Asia was called Kadena, and that's a base on Okinawa, which is now part of Japan. And the third was a base on the south coast of Thailand called Utapao. And that was a Royal Thai Air Force base, and we were there as their guests, flying bombing missions out of it. Out of Guam, out of Anderson Air Force Base, the missions were 14 hours long, and they involved 2 in-flight refuelings. I was the guy in charge of making sure there was a rendezvous between the tanker and the bomber, so that we could get enough fuel to continue the mission. This happened twice on one of those 14-hour missions. It was kind of fun because the tankers that refueled us were KC-135s, which are DC 707, not DC, Boeing 707s, that took off from a base in Taiwan, CCK, and would rendezvous with us on the west coast of the big island of the Philippines, Luzon. And I was the one who was responsible for making sure that the bomber and the tanker started 100 miles apart, flew toward each other. And then I was using my radar for this. And then I would have the tanker do a 180-degree rollout. They were at an altitude about 1,000 feet higher than this. If it worked perfectly, the tanker would roll out 1,000 feet or so above the bomber and slightly in front. That's the way it was supposed to work. It was awfully a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Vibrations. I mean, it was difficult sometimes, but it always worked. We always got our gas. What would happen then is I would turn it over to the pilot, and there was a boom operator in the tanker who was lying in the back, and he would actually literally control the boom, which was a long, like, swizzle stick, a big, and the bomber had something on the roof above the pilots that opened up, and it was like the gas tank, or at least a gas receptacle, where and the boom operator would insert that into the hole on the bomber, and then it would lock on, and then the two pilots, the tanker pilot and the bomber pilot, would fly like that, locked together, until we've gotten the requisite amount of JP4, the fuel. Then they'd say disconnect, and they would disconnect, and the tanker would fly up, and the bomber would fly down, and adios, see you later. And that we did that twice out of a mission on. I was also out of Anderson Air Force Base. I was also the guy who was supposed to get, as a navigator, to get our crew. We flew in out of all three bases in what they call cells of three bombers. Lead bomber and then two other ones behind it, one to the left and one to the right. And when we would get within 10 or 15 minutes of our target, we would hit what they called an IP, an initial point, on a certain heading, and then we would turn control of the bombing run for the last few minutes over to what they call the miscue site on the ground, which is basically a radar site, many of them were manned by Australians. And they would direct us, heading, airspeed, and all that, to the target, and tell the lead bomber when to release. And the rest of us would release based on a stopwatch time from the initial release until our release. We had 125 bombs on each plane, and they were both 750-pound and 500-pound bombs under the wings and also in the bomb bay, the bomb bays have been especially adapted to hold that many of these weapons. So once we started releasing the ordnance over the target, we were often 29, 30, 31,000 feet above the ground, the plane would start to vibrate because the number of bombs is deep. When we took off from Anderson, we weighed like almost 500,000 tons. It was a huge plane. The wingspan on a B-52 from wingtip to wingtip, this is a great statistic, is farther than the Wright brothers' first flight. So, and then after that was over, then it was just deadhead for several hours back across the Philippines to Guam to land. The crew rest after one of those missions, which really amounted to about an 18-hour day, was a couple of days. We were often bombing targets that were based on 3-day-old intelligence of North Vietnamese troop movements, concentrations of arms and armaments or whatever. But oftentimes it was 3 days is a long time, especially when your enemy is riding around in the jungle on little Honda motorcycles, moving very quickly and great distances, or living underground. So we all, especially the people on the ground, developed an enormous respect for the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese. I mean, they were just ingenious. And, they could live on 8 ounces of rice a day and move through the jungle with no difficulty at all. So there it was, and we bombed, depending on our targets, literally from the Delta, which is the southern part of Vietnam, all the way up to the DMZ, which separated then South Vietnam from North Vietnam. We also bombed in Cambodia and in Laos as well, at targets there. So you asked about the first one. The first one went the way it was described in textbooks. Nothing went wrong. There were other missions that were a little more dicey, with turbulence, or once we were on our way back to Okinawa, and there was a fire warning light on the dashboard in front of the pilot, and it was in the bomb bay, and we thought, oh, that's not good. We had already released all the bombs, so we didn't know what it could be. So what I did is I crawled back in the bomb bay to see if there was a fire there. but there wasn't. And I was able to report that, got back in my seat, but crew commander decided that with the fire warning light, our protocol was pretty clear. Land at the nearest emergency base, which happened to be in the Philippines, Clark Air Force Base, big base. It's gone now. It was buried under volcanic ash in 1989, 1990. Now, Pinatubo exploded through lava all over the place. Anyway, Clark, beautiful Air Force Base, built in the early 20th century. So we landed there, emergency landing, and got into the base ops. And there were 3 phone calls waiting for us. One was from the wing commander in Okinawa, wondering why we had landed in the Philippines. So we told him. He said, "Fine, I'll send a crew down there, take a look at your plane, fix it, get you back up here as soon as possible." The second was from the president of the Philippines, because B-52s were his office. B-52s were a source of considerable contention, political contention during the war, because of their size and because of their destructive capacity. And the President Marcos, his office wanted to know the same thing, why we had landed in his country. And we told him, and he said, "Okay, park the plane where no one can see it from outside the base, so no one will know that you're here. And then take off and leave as soon as you can." Right. The third call was from the U.S. ambassador to the Philippines. We told him why we were there, and he said, "It would have been better if you bailed out over the South China Sea instead of risking this international incident." We said, "Thank you for sharing that with us. We're glad we're here. I'm sorry you don't think the same way we do." Anyway, so we were there for a day or two until they could get the plane fixed and send us back up. And there wasn't a fire. It was on another flight back to Okinawa, and this was in late July 1969. That and we were flying back, and it was so quiet. It was Sunday morning, and we had the HF radio, which is a radio that picks up transmissions, broadcasts from all over the place. And we were listening to the first moon landing, to Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin talking to Houston. And just there they were, coming into our headsets over, and one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. And I said to the rest of the crew, I said, there's probably nobody else in the world between us and them right now. We were the closest thing to those guys that were landing on the moon. There may have been another plane somewhere, but we were pretty close. And we thought that was pretty cool. And that, and those two tours of duty in Southeast Asia comprised my experience in Vietnam, in the war. The first was in 1969, from summer to Christmas, and the second was in 1970. Excuse me, about the same time frame, summer to late fall, early winter, and then back to California.